This podcast is sponsored by Ramp. Are you a business leader considering a new credit card and spend management system? You could stick with the old school process, multiple systems that work against each other and create more work for you. Or you could try Ramp. Ramp helps businesses manage their finance operations with a corporate card and spend management software that includes accounting automation, vendor payments, travel booking, and more, all in one platform. Whether you're a startup, a small business, or have thousands of employees, Ramp's intuitive software gives you maximum control over spend. Ramp's smart tools enforce compliance, prevent fraud, and provide real-time insights. Stop overspending and save up to 5%. Plus, Ramp automates data entry and routine time-consuming tasks. It's all done for you. You'll close your books in hours instead of days and give your team time to focus on what really matters, the bottom line. And now get $250 when you join Ramp for free. Just go to ramp.com/easy. Ramp.com/easy. RAMP.com/easy.
Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank, members FDIC. Terms and conditions apply.
We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices, episode 31. I'm Jessica Uquinto, and I'll be your host today. And today we are talking about reclaiming Indigenous histories and the Indigenous Paleolithic. Before we begin, I'd like to honor and acknowledge that the lands I'm recording on today are part of Nooch or Ute Treaty Lands, as well as part of the Dinétah and the ancestral Puebloan homeland. So today we have Dr. Paulette Steeves on the podcast. Dr. Paulette Steeves is an Indigenous paleoarchaeologist currently working as an assistant professor in history and philosophy at Algoma University, where she is also a nominee for a Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Healing and Reconciliation. She also serves as adjunct faculty at Mount Allison University. She has additionally previously taught at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Fort Peck Community College, Selkirk College, and the State University of New York at Binghamton. She received her MA and PhD in anthropology from SUNY Binghamton, where she also received a certificate in evolutionary studies. Her research is framed in Indigenous method and theory and is focused on reclaiming and rewriting the Pleistocene histories of Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Steeves.
Tansy, thank you for having me.
So let's get started. I always ask at the beginning about how people got into this field. And you have kind of a non-traditional story of how you got into this field. Do you want to let our listeners know about how that went for you?
Well, I moved to the USA from Canada, I think it was in 1995, as a way to find an area where my son had really bad asthma and allergies, where he could live better. And we ended up in the Ozarks. And after working for a year, I applied to go to school because I'd always wanted to go to college, even though I was older. I didn't have the opportunity when I was younger because of my background and the schools I went to. And we weren't encouraged as First Nation students to even think about college. So I did apply. I just wrote my grade 12 and got my GED and applied. And after my first year, had a full ride and got into the honors program. And I was actually doing pre-med, thinking of becoming a doctor. And one of the tribes from Oklahoma had asked me if I could help them to reclaim their ancestors' remains from museums in some way. And they were talking about possibly using genetics. So I got a grant as an undergrad honors student and worked with the community from Oklahoma. And we typed their mitochondrial DNA from their elders. And so we didn't have a lab at the University of Arkansas, but a really great lab at UC Davis did the work, the genetic work for us. And just the pressure of doing that first piece of the research was enough to move the museums and universities to return the ancestors. So I really think the museums and universities that held the community's ancestors knew that they belonged to them. They came from their home territories, but they were using loopholes in NAGPRA to not return the remains. And it was very important to the community to reinter their ancestors. So we did the first piece of the research and were able to get the mitochondrial DNA from tribal elders. The second piece would have been to see if we could match it to the ancestors who were being held by the museums. But like I say, the museums and universities pretty much knew that they belonged to that community. And so before we even did the second piece of the research, the community got 500 of their ancestors back and reburied them. So that I really had to think about that. That was a very powerful moment for me to realize that we could use archaeology and anthropology and science to support work that communities wanted to have done. So that was a pretty amazing moment. So I really started thinking after that about whether I wanted to continue on to med school or to be an archaeologist.
And so what ultimately, was that what finalized that decision for you to switch?
I thought about it for a while, but back in 1988, I became a newly divorced single mom with 3 children. And I was living in my little home community in British Columbia. And I went to talk to a Salish elder there, Leonard Sampson. And he said, yes, this is a hard time for you. But he told me, he said, the other elders and I have watched you grow up, and we feel really strongly that you have a job to do that's going to really help Indian people. He said, not just us, but all Indian people all over. And I'm a single parent and I have a great education. What am I going to do? He said, you're going to do a lot, but it's going to be a lot harder than this. Well, at the time, I really couldn't imagine anything being harder, but I never forgot what he said. And it took me until I was almost finished graduate school to realize, oh, that's what he meant. I just have to rewrite world history. Okay.
Just have to rewrite all of archaeology. No big deal.
Yeah, for the Americas, for North and South America. But I never forgot what he said. All those years I kept thinking about it. And we're taught growing up not to listen to the voices. I mean, genocide was so thorough. It tried to change our cultural ways so much that, if we talked about spirits or listening to ancestors, we were crazy. Well, you can't let that all go and learn to listen. You need to reclaim those ceremonies and those indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And for me, across time, I had to do that. I had to reclaim those ways and learn to listen. And as an undergrad, to have a community come to you and ask you to do genetic work and then to get the funding and then be successful and then see their ancestors come home, that's not just me or the community. That's creator, that's ancestors, that's listening. That the community was listening, that nobody wants to do genetic work, but they were listening and they thought, well, maybe this is how we push the button and we get our ancestors returned. And they were right. So just learning to listen and to trust those thoughts, those dreams, those messages that come to you is really important.
Yeah, they put a lot of trust in you, that's for sure. Especially, like you said, an undergrad.
Yeah.
How did you guys even get connected?
I met with their NAGPRA representative at a meeting. So a parks official was coming and he was presenting his data on a park that was in their homeland, and he wanted to dig up more remains. And I asked him, and he got real snitty with me. So this lady came to talk to me after the meeting and introduced herself. I was about the only First Nations Native American student in the whole department, and they were looking for somebody in archaeology or in science to work with. And being that I have Indigenous roots and we were brought together, that's just how we were brought together. And that parks official from Arkansas saw us talking later and assumed that we had set him up to ask these questions. He actually published in a government journal an article calling me a ventriloquist toady and a dummy. and insulting her. So of course I addressed that because you don't need to put those things in a published journal. And wrong. Like I hadn't even met her. So
wow.
So that was another.
Not to mention that's a very reasonable question. Like, why? Yeah. Why do you need to do this?
Right. You have hundreds of thousands of remains already in museums and storages. Why do you want to, disturb?
Mm-hmm.
And he was really upset that I dared to ask that question. Right. So that's how I met the NAGPRA representative from that community. And then they ended up hiring me as their NAGPRA intern. So I actually learned quite a bit from that position and working with that community.
And then, so did you continue on doing this type of work, or how did it go from there?
After I graduated, I moved to Miami, Florida, because there was a really good high school there that was for gifted students, and I wanted both my students to go. So I did end up living in Miami, Florida, and working in a medical school for 3 years in ortho rehab. So I did all of the surgeries to remove bone and tissue and tendon from deceased donors and prepare it for surgery. And I did that because my older son was in the hospital a lot when he was young.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a lot of very sick children, and I saw a lot of children that had bone cancer. And in Canada, they'll take off the diseased bone, and we knew a little girl who they used her foot and sewed it backwards on her knee so she would have a joint. But if you have donor material, donor human bone, the children don't have to lose their limbs. You just replace the piece of bone. And so I went to Miami, and we didn't have much money. And I think I was waitressing, and two women came into this lounge I was waitressing in, and they ordered straight up double tankery gins. And I was like, oh my God, right? They're really, these are some strong ladies. And they started talking to me, and they said, oh, you're new. And I said, yeah, I just graduated. Well, what with? And I told them, and we got a job for you. Well, I'd been trying to get a job at the med school, and you can't even get in the door there.
Mm-hmm.
But I met them, and see, this is how Creator and ancestors work. I met them in this kind of little dive bar by the river that they dropped into. And the next day I had a job in ortho rehab, and I ended up running a cell growth lab there and getting a lot of really good experience and working in ortho rehab for 3 years. And when my kids graduated, that's when I left Miami and I went into archaeological field work.
So had all your kids left by then? I mean, it was just the two that...
My oldest son passed away in 1999. He wasn't supposed to live to even be 6 because his asthma and allergies were that bad, but he made it to 21. And
wow,
that was in Arkansas. And so our 2 children went to, it's called DASH, Design and Architecture Senior High in Miami, Florida. An awesome school, an awesome principal. It was just a wonderful experience for them. And they went off to college, which they didn't stay in, but I'm not a pushy mother, so they're both gifted in their own ways. And then, so when they went off to college, that's when I went off to start archaeological field work. And I did that for 5 years all over the United States and a little bit in Canada.
So what was that experience like, shifting then into CRM work?
It was really fun. So my previous job at the University of Miami, I was inside all the time. And when you have a donor, you're wrapped up in gowns and surgery and very sterile operating rooms under great stress for like minimally 8 hours for each donor. And then you assist with the autopsy. So after 3 years and about 300 autopsy assists and recoveries, it was really, really, really nice just to be back out in nature, to be out in the trees and the forest and hiking. And I learned with some really good people. And I did a couple of archaeological surveys in the South, in some swamps and mucky areas. And then I got on this amazing excavation right in Cherokee, North Carolina. It was a huge, one of the biggest excavations they've ever had. And it was being carried out by a CRM firm, but with the Park Service and with the Cherokee tribe. The tribe had traded lands with the Park Service to build a new school. So this was a full mitigation of an area. And so 2 years later, of course, the CRM firm said, oh, there's not much here. We'll be done in 6 months. And I left 2 years later. There was over 107 prehistoric houses and everything from the recent times back to 12,000 years. It was just the most incredible, amazing experience for an archaeologist. And then I did another 3 years all over, everywhere from, New York and New Brunswick to California, and a lot of places in between, and some surveys, like I think it was 167 miles from Texas over to Mississippi, surveying the whole way. So it was really,
Wow.
it was a great experience, and it showed me that our people covered the land, just covered the land. Every single mile of that long survey had between 3 and 9 sites. But it also showed me how disrespectful many field archaeologists are and how uninformed they are. So they've never, ever had a class in First Nations or Native American history. And they're out there just doing surveys and quite often destroying sites or being willing to watch sites be destroyed. Some do really good work, but CRM is for a for-profit business. And for a lot of young archaeologists, it's a party. It's a big party. Let's go on a hike and, find some sites and then let's party. And when I started running crews, none of the partiers were on my crew because we'd leave at 4 or 5 in the morning and get done before it got to be 110 at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But I did see a lot of amazing sites. It was an amazing experience to do that. I think, though, I was actually fired off my last 3 or 4 jobs in Utah because I refused to sign off on sites being destroyed for oil pad roads. I refused to lie about sites being present. I just didn't go along with a lot of what other archaeologists went along with.
Yeah, that's really disappointing, especially since that's right in my neck of the woods, obviously.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're actually already at our first break point, but then we will get back and jump right back into all of this.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code HEVO, H-E-V-O.
Hi, Drew and Jonathan Scott here, reminding you that a lot of life's firsts are better with help from American Family Insurance. Like your first home expansion or your first big lightning strike. There's a first for everything. Get the right home policy at the right price with the right help from American Family's agents. Life's better when you're under American Family's roof. Insure carefully, dream fearlessly. Get a quote and find an agent at amfam.com.
Products not available in every state. American Family Mutual Insurance Company SI and its operating company 6000 American Parkway, Madison, Wisconsin.
This podcast is sponsored by Ramp. Are you a business leader considering a new credit card and spend management system? You could stick with the old school process, multiple systems that work against each other and create more work for you. Or you could try Ramp. Ramp helps businesses manage their finance operations with a corporate card and spend management software that includes accounting automation, vendor payments, travel booking, and more, all in one platform. Whether you're a startup, a small business, or have thousands of employees, Ramp's intuitive software gives you maximum control over spend. Ramp's smart tools enforce compliance, prevent fraud, and provide real-time insights. Stop overspending and save up to 5%. Plus, Ramp automates data entry and routine time-consuming tasks. It's all done for you. You'll close your books in hours instead of days and give your team time to focus on what really matters. The bottom line, And now get $250 when you join Ramp for free. Just go to ramp.com/easy. Ramp.com/easy. ramp.com/easy.
Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank, members FDIC. Terms and conditions apply.
And we are back. So we were just talking about your work in CRM and how CRM companies were doing some unethical work and asking you to be part of that. And it was interesting reading one of your articles that you sent me where you were talking, let's see, it's Academia, Archaeology, CRM, and Typos is the article. And you were talking about CRM and the unethical practices. And it was interesting. It definitely made me think about the fact that basically, like you were just saying, that, I mean, CRM obviously it's a money-making enterprise. And because of that, it does seem like there's a lot of practices in archaeology that kind of make it to CRM last, I guess you would say, like working with tribes. But I guess I'd never really thought about it that way, that CRM does seem to be kind of behind, academia or behind the nonprofit world or, federal agencies even in working with tribes. So that was kind of an interesting perspective that you mentioned that I hadn't really thought of exactly in that way.
Yeah, well, there's nobody out there policing it.
Mm-hmm.
We pulled up to a site one time I pulled up with a friend who's Native American, and we got out. You could hear the archaeologists hollering, "Oh, the Indians are here! Hide everything!" Right? And you got to remember, prior to NAGPRA in 1990, they didn't talk to any Native American tribes. They were against the Indians or including them. NAGPRA ordered them to consult. And so they only consult on federal or tribal lands. They don't consult on a lot of other projects, and they don't want to. It's just been a practice, and in some areas that's changing. It's changing a bit I think more in Canada than in the United States, but it needs to change.
Right.
It needs to become a lot more ethical.
Well, and I think that's part of probably why I hadn't quite thought about it that way, is that, again, I do live and most of my work is in the Southwest, the U.S. Southwest. And it is, from my understanding, at least, a lot more common in CRM here than anywhere else in the U.S., where, it's not unusual for CRM firms to work directly with tribes. And I don't think that's the case in other regions of the U.S. And it's certainly not like everybody in the Southwest does it, but it's something that is not uncommon.
Yeah, there are pockets like the Southwest, anywhere where you have a lot of Native American or First Nations communities, and they push involved. But it's unfortunate. There's a lot of places even close to you, like Utah, they never consult with tribes, and they just it's not even a question that comes to their mind. They just don't, because nobody ever has, and it would just be another thing that would take away from their
revenue
to go have meetings and do things.
Yeah, especially because it does, it takes a lot of work to do it right. It takes a lot of work, and it, that's time, and time is money, and so I don't know how to put that incentive there for CRM firms to make that change.
Well, NAGPRA ordered them to make that change, but like I say, that's only in specific smaller areas of the USA, and I'm glad that's in place. In other areas, communities have leveraged their voices and their concerns. Like the project I worked on in the Northeast here, the firms that wanted drilling to build the big wind towers out in the continental were pressured that tribes may not agree with everything they want to do unless they first had an understanding of the Pleistocene and the early history of that area when the continental shelf was dry land. And so I received a grant from one of the windmill firms that wanted to work with the communities. And so if they wanted to do that specific work, they were kind of pushed or forced to meet with those communities up there and to do this piece of work on those communities' early histories. And what it showed was that, God, at 13,000 years, people covered the land, and the continental shelf was dry land. It was a very diverse, rich place for people. So anywhere now underwater on the continental shelf could possibly hold cultural resources. So you need to have a monitor on any ship, any drilling rig, anytime they're moving dirt out there to put in these big wind towers.
Yeah, so can you give a little bit more background on what that project was? It's a pretty interesting one.
Well, it's constantly been denied that people were here during or prior to the last glacial maximum. But the communities there have oral traditions and stories that link them to the land. And there's a reservation out on Martha's Vineyard. The communities are very much still attached to their lands there. So they're able to leverage their voices. They came together as a group because they're very concerned about their early sites. So they asked me to put together a research project to be able to show their history on the land there. And I think I got up to over 200 sites dated between 10,000 and 12,000 years just in the Northeast, and hundreds of loose point finds. The land was just covered. There was also a shrimp trawler dredged up a mastodon skull with a beautiful laurel leaf point at the very edge of the banks, and that mastodon skull dated 23,000 years. Well, we know that was dry land, so sure there could have been people out there. But because there's such a denial that people were here much earlier than 12,000 years, the communities, the tribal communities, really wanted to see what there was for evidence of people there during these time frames. So I think I hired 8 undergrad students, and we did a huge research project, and we mapped all these sites and pulled the big report together and showed that the land there was covered with people at 13,000 years ago. So, for protecting early cultural sites, it's very important to have data and to know that, and to make those companies that are going to be doing earth disturbing pay attention.
Yeah, so is that the project that got you starting to look at this kind of work, or was there something before that got you interested in looking at Pleistocene Indigenous histories?
I started looking in early grad school. So I had gone to grad school actually in the STEM field in genetics, realizing the power of genetics in helping the community. I did in Arkansas and Oklahoma. But I found out the genetics lab wasn't quite as ethical as I'd hoped. They had a long ways to go to catch up to required ethics standards. So I switched programs to archaeology, and I started thinking about, I'd heard about these couple of early sites. I just knew of a few. So I just emailed someone, cold called them kind of out of the blue at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I emailed Steve Holland because I'd heard he'd worked on a site. And I said, how many sites are there? How many do you know about? And he said, well, I'll give you a list of 10, but don't tell anyone what you're working on because they're just going to think you're crazy. Well, if you're going to do this for your dissertation, it'd be pretty hard not to tell anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I started looking into it because there were a lot of things in deep time that really interested me besides archaeology sites. And I had my son helping me at the time doing literature research. And in 2 weeks, we found over 200 sites. And a month later, we knew of over 500 sites. And I'm like, how do you have this many sites between 12,000 and 200,000 years if people didn't get here till 12,000 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
If you took the youngest group of those sites, say between 12 and 13,000 years, and you map them out, and they cover pretty much all of North and South America and a lot of areas, people had to be here sometime before. So that just brought more questions. And I just really delved into it after that. And like I say, doors open. Creator has a way of telling us what we're supposed to do. So I think it was my second year of grad school, and I actually got an award from the SAA, a $5,000 award, Native American award for field research. And then Steve Holen from the Denver Museum got a hold of me and said, hey, we're going to do some survey and work on some of these early Pleistocene sites this summer. And we have a $5,000 grant. And so there was my field research paid for. So
nice.
I went and I worked with him for 2 years, and I worked on sites like the Lacina site, which is over 18,000 years old, and a number of sites in Kansas and the Great Plains. And of course, was then able to study a lot of materials at the Denver Museum. I learned about the Soretti site. Steve had mentioned it one day, and I was able to somehow, I forget who gave it to me, I got a copy of the original report, the California DOT report on this site near San Diego that had a mastodon with suspected human activity. And no one had dated it at that time, but from the soils, it was looking to be over 100,000 years old. So Steve Holen and another group sat on those artifacts, kept them at the museum in San Diego until the dating technologies got to a place they could not be questioned. And they dated it. And in 2017, it was published in Nature, and it's a 130,000-year-old site. That was one of the sites I ended up including in my dissertation study. So getting that site published is a really big accomplishment for Steve Holen and for, I think it's Richard Soretti and others from the Museum of Man in San Diego. And then it was the Discover Magazine 2017 second best story of the year, science year. So people are accepting now this work and this site. Of course, a lot of archaeologists jumped on it and critiqued it and bashed them, and, it gets real ugly. People just aren't aware of all of the evidence from all the archaeological sites and from oral traditions and the evidence of early humans in Asia and mammal migrations across the Bering Land area across millions of years. Mammals that arose in the Americas ended up in Asia, like horses, the first primates, proto-primates, saber-toothed cats, camels. Those mammals all arose in the Americas. They can't fly, so they have to walk. They need food where they're going. So there was an open corridor. So there's been some wonderful paleo-environmental studies and maps done that show that all of North America and Asia was a subtropical forest or a vast savanna for hundreds of thousands of years when early humans, were living in Asia. So if you have early humans living in Asia and you got mammals coming both ways, back and forth between Asia and the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, why didn't humans? To see that, humans may have been here 100 to 200,000 years ago. Well, yeah, it's possible. But if you ask most archaeologists, it's impossible, it's impossible. That's what they've taught people for decades. So
right.
It's unfortunate, but people are taught to trust the authority of expert voices in knowledge production. But due to colonial policies, anthropology and archaeology were born of colonial parentage, right?
Right.
And archaeologists understand there's power in the past. And when you look at the early field, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, everybody worked for the nation state. So colonization was going full bore, lands were being stolen, people were being dehumanized. We couldn't possibly have a history because indigenous peoples were framed as being a part of nature, not humans that had culture, but a part of nature. That made it okay to kill them, steal their land, commit genocide. Anthropology was a big part of racism and racializing. They were a part of creating what the Nazis used. The whole, the whole program of of annihilating people because they were undesirable. So anthropology and archaeology have had to change from those. They started changing in the 50s after the Second World War and looking more to physical anthropology as something to study disease and to study massacres rather than eugenics. So there's had to be a lot of changes. But if you look into early archaeology, you'll see that Alex Herlichka, who's been discussed as an avowed racist, worked for the Smithsonian. He was their first physical anthropologist. He argued that the Indians had only been in the Americas for 3,000 years. And he was very adamant. Nobody could change his mind. And it's talk about making links. Jesse Figgins from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in 1927 changed that. So he had been alerted to some very huge mammal bones with beautiful points in New Mexico, near the town of Clovis. And it took a few years of arguing with Herlichka and having others visit, and he had to do more than one excavation and leave everything in place till people came and saw it. But that's when the time frame for early peoples here was changed to around 10 to 12,000 years, because points were found with an extinct bison that was known to have been extinct for 10 to 12,000 years. While that time frame has been stuck there since the late 1920s. So human history everywhere else in the world is changing. People are finding more sites, more evidence for evolution, but it never changes in the. Recently, people have argued that, okay, so it's a little older because we have the Monteverde site in Chile that's dated to 12,500 years. People were definitely there. So they had to be here earlier than Clovis. So the beautiful Clovis tool is dated between around 10,800 to around 11,500 with a few outlier years. So that beautiful Clovis tool is what archaeology used to place people here at 10 to 12,000 years, basically. Unfortunately, nowhere in the world has there ever been a pan-hemispheric cultural group. But anthropology and archaeology created these stories about the first people of the Americas. First of all, they were Asians who came from Asia, and Asia didn't exist, neither did Asians 12,000 years ago. They brought this beautiful tool with them because the indigenous people here didn't have the skills to create this, of course. Everything had to come from Europe or Asia. So they created this story of the Clovis people, and a lot of it was very dehumanizing of indigenous peoples of the Americas. There's a lot of problems with that Clovis first theory. The theory that those beautiful stone tools all came from somewhere else outside of the Americas. They spent probably millions of dollars in decades looking for those tools in Siberia and Asia and Europe, never found them because they arose here. That technology was built here in the Americas. So recently, archaeologists have had to kind of give up that ghost and say, okay, they developed in the Southeast United States. And I think they were shared with a lot of other groups of people. So the Clovis people have been discussed by anthropologists and archaeologists as the first people of the Americas. And anywhere you find Clovis tools, you have Clovis people. But what that creates is a giant pan-hemispheric group of people. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Culture is more than one tool. What that does is erase the indigenous diversity of this continent. So the only place the Clovis people ever existed really was in the wildest imagination of the archaeological mind. But that is so embedded as fact that the Library of Congress has a Dewey Decimal number in the cultural section for the Clovis people. So you go to the library, I went at UMass, you have the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and you have the Clovis people. God, there's no such thing. There is no such thing. And what that does is erase immense cultural diversity. And if you're looking at diversity, look at languages. So you would expect to find the largest number of language families in the world, maybe where people had been the longest, because it's been argued that one language family might take 6,000 years, or a new language might take 6,000 years to develop. So if you look around the world, I think there's roughly 380 language families. You would expect to find the most in Africa. So this is a real mystery to scholars, because I think Europe has 3. I forget how many Africa has, but the Americas has more than 50% or close to 50% of the languages of the entire world. I think there's over 180 language families in North and South America. And remember, that's what we know of the 5% of people that survived contact.
Right.
So if you look further back in time, prior to contact, how many more language families and languages were there that we don't know about? So the diversity of languages here really shows the diversity of people and cultures. It was immense, absolutely immense, very rich and culturally diverse. But yet archaeologists for decades have called us Asians from Asia who became the Clovis people. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's like Vine Deloria said, people don't challenge these things and look at how actually absurd these statements are. They're taught as fact, but they're not based on any scientific data at all.
Well, we are already at our next stopping point, but I have about 50 bajillion questions for you when we get back.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Really good stuff. So we'll be right back.
Hello, it's Jim Eagle. Please join us for the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit Society's 11th Annual Two-Spirit Powwow in person or online this year at San Francisco Fort Mason Center on Saturday, February 12th, 2022. Gourd dance at noon and grand entry begins at 1 p.m. There will be over 60 vendors selling all types of indigenous products and crafts. Powwow dancers from all over the U.S. will be competing in contests all day long. We'll also be having several delicious fry bread taco vendors. For more information, go to baits.org. That's BAAITS.org. COVID protocols will be in effect. See you there.
Hi, Drew and Jonathan Scott here, reminding you that a lot of life's firsts are better with help from American Family Insurance. Like your first home expansion or your first big lightning strike. There's a first for everything. Get the right home policy at the right price with the right help from American Family's agents. Life's better when you're under American Family's roof. Insure carefully, dream fearlessly. Get a quote and find an agent at amfam.com.
Products not available in every state. American Family Mutual Insurance Company SI and its operating company 6000 American Parkway, Madison, Wisconsin.
We are back. Okay, so listening to everything you were just saying, I have a million questions. And I guess one thing that I want to ask about, I do know that we have a decent number of our listeners who are from the general public. And again, I am not an archaeologist by training. I'm an ethnographer by training. So my first question is more about how you date sites that are that old. I mean, are you literally just looking at like the stratigraphy of the ground, like how deep it is, stuff like that? So that's my first question. And my second question is, it was interesting. You were just saying about how some of the parts of the Bering Strait theory are just so absurd, but they just get repeated. And I remember being in college and having she's a biological anthropology professor, and she was talking about the Bering Strait theory and how basically the idea is people were, they had to walk across because there wasn't another way to get across. And yet there were people, in Hawaii and all across the Pacific Islands that obviously take a huge amount of skill and knowledge to get to. So the fact that they would have to, this idea that like people couldn't have gotten to the Americas until there was a way for them to walk across just doesn't really make any sense. But so why do you think this theory is so hard to challenge? Like even today, it's people even recognize that it's a lot more complex than that it's all of these things, and yet it just seems so hard to get away from it.
Well, colonization has, and archaeologists and academics have created an acceptable social story of Indigenous peoples of the Americas, right? We're very recent and we're not from here. We're from Asia. When you challenge that, you really upset them. When you start discussing history and putting Indigenous people in the same timeframes and early spaces as people from the rest of the world. And there's a really good word that kind of explains it, agontology. So agontology is defined as how knowledge has not come to be and how ignorance is produced through neglect, secrecy, suppression, destruction of documents, unquestioned tradition, and social political selectivity. It has power in the present. David Meltzer, I'll quote him, he said, archaeologists are acutely aware of the possible implications of the earlier peopling of the Americas, which reflects on contemporary issues of identity, ancestry, and ownership of the past and present. So there's a few reasons why it's really hard for people to accept a change in dates that Indigenous people have actually been here much earlier. Number one, it's been embedded as fact for decades and taught as fact, and people don't understand it's not based on data or fact. It's based on conjecture. So people are taught to trust a few well-placed archaeologists who deny the earlier peopling of the Americas. And then the general mass of academics supports that in their silence, not critiquing it and not questioning it. It's problematic because if you look at, so one of my questions when I started looking at this research is, okay, so here's the Bering Strait theory. What is it based on? And there's been some amazing work done by settler scholars in environmental studies and geological studies. And they've shown that the whole story is not based on anything but conjecture. They've shown that the so-called ice-free corridor that ran on the east side of the Rockies was still covered in ice when people were here, and the ice wouldn't have melted and food wouldn't have grown in time for people to have used that area for the initial peopling. None of the Clovis points found here have ever been found outside of here. And you don't come to a place and all of a sudden start making beautiful tools. The Clovis point is an apex. It's the height of tool making. So people had to be here quite a while before making tools to get to that point. And then, as you mentioned about boats, so they found some sites now on Crete that date to over 100,000 years. Apparently, you could never get there without a boat. So there's a lot of places that people went that they actually use watercraft. And I don't think that early humans are given the credit they deserve for their skill and their intelligence. I mean, they've been traveling the world for millions of years. It's what they did. So why wouldn't they cross water and use boats? So people could have used boats to get here. But if you go back prior to the glacial maximum around 24,000 years ago, there was dry land. So people didn't even need a boat here prior to the glacier. And it's the same with a lot of areas of the world. People walked from Africa to Asia, and nobody's questioning that. People were in Australia at 80,000 years. Nobody's questioning that. But if you say that people were in the Americas now more than 12 or 15,000 years, you get academically destroyed. People strongly question that. That's political. That's not based on the archaeological record or the environmental record or the paleontological record. That's based in racism and politics. And that's based in the beliefs of people who live on stolen lands, where many of the First Nations people are now minorities still living in systems of apartheid who have gone through a genocide. Settler populations and academics have a lot to come to grasp with. And it's Indigenous scholars that are out there learning and teaching and writing and doing research that are opening these really important discussions. I mean, it's a big difference that people have been here over 100,000 years as opposed to 12,000 years. It's a big difference politically, but it fits much better with what we know of the human history of migrations on a global scale.
That is kind of an interesting thing that you mentioned there about it being politics, because, for example, when I mentioned to people that I was going to have you on this podcast, I definitely got a response of like, oh, well, is that based in science? You know, like in the sense of like, is this person just like wanting, things to be like that? Or is this actually, and I feel like it's almost actually the opposite. Like people, again, it's like you find a date that's older than what people think, quote unquote, it should be. And people are like, oh, it's probably a mistake. And like, you know what I mean? Like there's like the throwing it out.
Yeah, they're not
when it
good
doesn't
scientists.
fit.
Well, it's funny. I think it was Tom Delahaye, or no, it was one of the women archaeologists in California that said, she'd done all this work, and as long as her sites were younger than 12,000 years, she was a wonderful archaeologist. But the minute she found a site that was older, she wasn't even a scientist. So here's an example of how racism and the power of story is embedded in archaeology. The greatest paleontologist in the world, Louis Leakey, right, found the early humans in Africa. This man knows archaeology sites. He knows paleontology. He came to California and worked on a site in Southern California called the Calico site. And the minute he said that site was older than 200,000 years, he was a crazy old man, right? So anybody saying that sites are older than what's acceptable to the nation state, what's acceptable to people who have been taught through colonial racist ideologies, anything that challenges those beliefs that keep us minimal and infantile in time are wrong. So it can't possibly be science. It is so embedded. And if people would just look at that original story and how absurd it is, and that there is no data, there is no real data to say that Clovis is the earliest tool. There are hundreds of sites that say there are older tools and older places. So when my book comes out, I guess people might have something to go on. I guess not everybody wants to go do all this research on their own. Mm-hmm. But a lot of other people have been saying that people have been here earlier. So there have been a lot of white settler archaeologists who have done these sites. I couldn't have done my work without their first doing work. But these guys were really academically destroyed for saying sites were older. That's not science. That's not academia. That's hate and that's racism. There's a real issue there that hasn't been discussed, and it's an issue in archaeology, right? Mm-hmm. And so why would you go after, your typical white settler archaeologist because he said a site was older than 12,000 years? Well, because you don't want people to be here earlier. The genetic reports that they've had out, they're not even correct. And so it's also agentology. It's not what they're telling you, it's what they're not telling you. And so these stories out that, there was the Anzac child and they did his DNA and, everybody's related to the Anzac child and he was here 12 to 14,000 years ago, but everybody's related to him. What they're not telling you is that's based on very little data. I recently asked one of the top geneticists from the Max Planck lab because I want to make sure that I'm correct in my book still. And I said, there was very little genetic data, very little genetic samples that this is all based on. Am I incorrect? Is it still very little? And he said, no, it's still less than 1/10 of 1%. So the whole genetic story that you see splashed around in articles about us all being related is based on 1/10 of 1% of the 5% of the 95%. And people start doing more genetic work like they have in South America on different communities, they're finding more genetic diversity. And so that's agantology. They're framing a story to support their research and saying, oh, look, I have the answer. And they were only here maybe 14,000 years. And they're not telling you, they don't have 99% of the data that would represent all Indigenous peoples of the Americas. So part of it's really still an issue with academics who are misinforming people through their research. Very few, although there have been a few that have stated, okay, this is based on a very small data set, and that's problematic. You bet it's problematic, but it's dehumanizing and erasing diversity of all the Indigenous people of the Americas. So it's how we typically framed. There was a book I had to teach from as an undergrad. I was a teaching assistant, and there was an archaeology book for first-year students. So this is how colonialist discourses remain a factor in the maintenance of discrimination, racism, and the reproduction of colonialism in the academy. So the book was called Patterns in Prehistory, Humankind's First 3 Million Years. So here's a statement. They were defining what is an artifact. And the author stated, a beautifully shaped stone spear point from a 20,000-year-old campsite in France is an artifact, but so is an undistinguished stone flake some weary Indian threw out in a Mississippi cornfield 1,000 years ago. Wenke and Olszewski, 2007, right? How did they know the Indian was weary? Read it from 1,000 years ago. Why would you do that? Why would you frame something from France as very old and beautiful and something from America as undistinguished, weary, and just chucked out in a field? So this is how this book is still out there being used in first-year archaeology classes. This is how students are taught to see our history. I mean, when I read it, I was just, what? This is egregious. It was so egregious. I had to email a few people like Joe Watkins and say, is this really egregious or is something wrong with me? And he goes, no, it's egregious. Wow. Because at that time I was just learning to like actually think critically enough to pick these things out. So that became a really good teaching point in the class that I was teaching at the time.
Okay. So we're like almost at the end. We're real close. But I do want to ask you, especially since what you were just talking about, you mentioned a lot that you use Indigenous methods and theories, and you're working on decolonizing and indigenizing curriculum, CRM, the academy, etc. So what does that look like to you?
Decolonizing and indigenizing the academy is something I learned the hard way that needed to be done. So being very honest, I mean, I did receive a full ride scholarship to grad school because I earned it. But when I got to grad school, there were a lot of issues. There was one Native American student there before me. They'd had an extremely hard time. And the minute I opened my mouth, I was attacked. And so from my first few months in grad school, I had to ask the department chair to create a committee regarding posters that were allowed to be displayed in the walls. So there had been a huge fight because there had been an open burial poster, not just put on a wall in the hallway of the anthropology department at Binghamton, put on the wall directly outside the door of the Native American student's office where he had to see it when he came out. And so there was a big fight before I got there. So I was able to push for having a committee formed to discuss proper displays. And after many tears and fighting with other people on the committee, we created a document. And, you know, I told them, I said, look, I've only been here a few months and you're really making me wish already I'd chosen a different school. Well, I kind of woke them up. You know, we had no rights. Our voice had no rights. I would be sitting in a class, and as with many classes where you have to discuss a lot, there's 3 or 4 students that read the papers and discuss, and I was one of them. And I had other students get so mad because I always had something to say, because I always read the papers, and because even if you didn't think I looked Native American or First Nation, the minute I opened my mouth, wow, there's no hiding it. And I had students jump up out of their chairs and scream at me to shut my mouth and watch what I said. Professors said nothing. I had professors shake their fist in my face and scream at me at the top of their lungs that I didn't dare search any sites in, South America. Like, I had so many people trying to push me out of grad school that it actually became a really fun game just to stay there and do better than everybody. So in a way, I was able to turn that game around. But it really taught me that we really need to help these people learn that we're just humans like everybody else. We've been through genocide. A lot of us still live in an apartheid-like system. We still face high discrimination. And the only way to change that, not the only way, but the best way, is through education. And to create that kind of education, we need to decolonize the academy. So I'm continually, every class, I ask my students at the end of the class, what did you know before this class regarding First Nations or Native American or Indigenous histories? What do you know now? Oh, you didn't learn much before this class? So I actually have them write a paper and tell me in any classes where they've been given an article or a book by an Indigenous scholar, seen an Indigenous film or anything Indigenous, a speaker. And very little is happening. So there's the odd settler professor who's really trying to learn and trying to incorporate Indigenous voices. But for the most part, people aren't. They're not picking up that challenge. They're not willing to put the work in to relearn. I mean, the ones that are doing, I think a lot of them are doing a great job. But we have a long, long way to go. And the best way to decolonize an academy is just to be there. So we need more students that are willing to get their masters and PhDs. And it's amazing. There's been this great burst in the last 10 years of Indigenous PhDs and Indigenous articles and books. And that's just amazing. That just makes me so happy. But we really need to support ourselves. We really need our peers to support us and to help us, because I think Marie Baptiste, she's a First Nation scholar here in Canada, and she said there's less than 2% of us in the academy. We're not going to change it. We need our peers to support us. We need to get as many publications out as we can and to do as much as we can to encourage other Indigenous students to keep going and to get their PhDs.
Yeah, I think that what she said there about only being 2% and needing allies, that's really huge. And I think there are resources out there now, like this podcast that I've heard some people have been sharing in classrooms. So I think the whole I don't know excuse is getting a little harder to use. Like, oh, I don't know any Indigenous authors. I don't know any, Indigenous archaeologists to have come talk to my class. Well, if you don't have one that you can share this podcast.
Yeah, no, this is super. This is really great. So I go to committee meetings and, committees, our department, we're talking about changing curriculums and healing and reconciliation and all the recommendations. And they immediately resort to their English and European writers and theories. And they're just like, oh, well, I have one poem by Simon Ortiz. I'm like, great. Mm-hmm. You need a lot more than one poem. But they're so invested, they're so invested in their education comes from 5 main countries in Europe. Mm-hmm. Right? That leaves out a great part of the world. Aren't you at least wondering what the rest of the world thinks? But they're so trained, invested to think only in that small pool. And they don't want to do the work to change, a lot of them. And then I have been asked, I've done classes, I give a workshop at Selkirk on indigenizing curriculum. 2 faculty came, right? So how many faculty want to come? And then My son said to me one day they wanted me to do it here at Algoma, but my time is really getting pressed. I have a lot of research and writing to do. And he said, Mom, they're adults with PhDs just like you. You know what? If they want to know, they can do the research themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're right. They can go online anytime and in their field type in, First Nations or Indigenous authored books in history, in math, in whatever, and it's almost like they're afraid to, and some are afraid to do it wrong. Well, heck, if you're going to do something, I don't mind talking to you. Come and ask me. But I think, faculty have to step up and do this themselves because they have PhDs. They are researchers. They know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people, they're already super busy, or they're doing this, or, they're doing that, and that would just be another thing to do. But education has always changed across time. And so this is one more change, but there's reluctance because it's not a white change. It's a change where you're accepting a minority voice into the academy that hasn't traditionally been there.
Well, I think we might already be over time. So could you explain real quick because we mentioned in your intro that you're a nominee for Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Healing and Reconciliation. And for those of us in the US and other parts of the world may not know what that is. So you explained it to me before we got on the air, but could you give everyone else a little bit of a intro into what that is?
Right. So there are Canada Research Chairs, Tier 2 and Tier 1 in a number of fields. It's a very prestigious position. It's a grant. So it's only granted to certain people whose research has been very well developed, whose research is innovative. I had one faculty tell me, once you get a Canada Research Chair, you never, ever apply for a job again because people just search you out. So people that get Canada Research Chairs are looked at as world experts in their field. It comes with a $600,000 grant across 5 years. It also comes with a class release, a course release. So instead of teaching 5 courses a year, I teach 1 per semester, 2 a year, which gives me a lot of time to do research and to train undergraduate and graduate students in research. For me, the extremely important thing would be for it to be accepted that, because you do a big application, it takes months, big grant application. And my entire grant application is based on the fact that a part of healing and reconciliation is recovering our history, recovering our humanity, recovering our identities across the Pleistocene and the Paleolithic, because I'm saying I have the data that shows we have been here over 100,000 years. So they won't announce it until the fall sometime. There are a few First Nations people here that have Canada Research Chairs, and that's really makes me happy to see that. A lot of them are in the STEM sciences, but a few are outside the STEM sciences. So it's a very prestigious position. It allows you to be pretty much a full-time researcher and to teach just 2 classes a year. So it's a real benefit for anybody that's serious about doing research and making world-altering changes.
Well, we'll all keep our fingers crossed for you on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, before we close out, is there any final thoughts that you wanted to share with our listeners, or probably just our members at this point? But any final points?
Yeah, I really hope that people will be open-minded. I hope they will learn, because I know that not everybody is taught this, and not everybody gets to go to university. But a lot of the people that are experts, they do really good work. But racism in the Americas has put this huge block on the history of the Americas, and that's embedded. And I want people to think critically about that and to look at the history of the rest of the world, because this doesn't match up that people would only be here very recently. I think when my book comes out, that people will have that whole package in one place, It's supposed to be out in the fall of 2020, and it'll be called The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere, the University of Nebraska Press. Got a lot of data in it. I tell it through a story because that's a part of Indigenous method and theory. And I tried to write the book so that anybody, even a layperson, could read it and understand it and get through the data and the steps. How I show that people have been here earlier. So I want people to realize that a part of a growing and a better world is being open-minded and thinking critically, because politics is changing, leadership is changing, education is changing, and it's changing from being extremely colonial to being less colonial. And there's a lot of good Indigenous authors and scholars and researchers. So I want people to know, especially students, if you're not given a book or a paper in your class by an Indigenous, Native American, or First Nations scholar, find one in that area and give it to your teacher.
Yeah. We don't talk a lot about what students can do, but that's a good one.
Students can be very active and very, very positive. Yeah, they've made great changes.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to let us know when the book comes out so we can share it with everyone. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. And I hope everyone will check out the show notes and continue to read some more.
Okay, thank you for having me on the show. Miigwech.
Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Heritage Voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Music Store. Also, if you like the show, please share with your friends or write us a review. If you have any questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org, or you can find me on Facebook through Living Heritage Anthropology or on Twitter @LivingHeritageA. As always, thank you to Lyle Belenqua and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Hi, Drew and Jonathan Scott here, reminding you that a lot of life's firsts are better with help from American Family Insurance. Like your first home expansion or your first big lightning strike. There's a first for everything. Get the right home policy at the right price with the right help from American Family's agents. Life's better when you're under American Family's roof. Insure carefully, dream fearlessly. Get a quote and find an agent at amfam.com.
Products not available in every state. American Family Mutual Insurance Company SI and its operating company 6000 American Parkway, Madison, Wisconsin.